As we continue to work our way through Romans, doing this complete makeover on our lives, on our hearts, and on our behavior, we now come to some of the more, active parts. God has said what He's going to do, and now He wants us to do what we're supposed to do. I want you to know that I learned my theology very young. This is a picture of one of the schools I attended. This is in Vollen, South Dakota. I suppose it would be called a three-room schoolhouse because we had 4 grades in one room, and then and the high school got all the upstairs. That was my dad's office, by the way. It's bad being the superintendent's kid because, if you get in trouble at school, you're going to get in trouble at home. There was just no escape. But I learned some very significant things in school that I have tried to unlearn the rest of my life. One of them was reading cards. Now, Donna probably, you remember these reading cards? Some of you remember these reading cards? Oh yeah. You started here at the front, and you'd go up and you'd get a card, and you'd read it, and then they'd have some questions for you. Well, if you got the questions wrong, you had to go read another card in that color. But if you got the questions right, then you could advance. I want you to know that this is the only thing that I ever beat my brother in. I waxed him good. And boy, was I proud of it. I worked hard. I beat him because he had to start in this level, and I got to start here, and they gave you points for every level you finished. So I finished them all, and I beat him. I learned that you need to work hard. I learned that you need to impress your fellow students. I learned that you needed to strive and to struggle, and that nothing came easy, and that if you didn't get these questions right, people would laugh at you, and if you got them right, you'd be proud and succeed in whatever. I also learned that that's not the way God works. And I had to unlearn that. God gives us His life. God gives us power. And therefore, we can work it out in our lives. He doesn't just let us say, go for it, and I'll reward you if you do good. He says, I will reward you if you accept what I have given you. If you trust me, if you find out who I am, and then follow after me. But God gives it to us, and then we use what He has given to us. It's not a matter of struggling all of our lives. It's a matter of trusting all of our lives. We have to back up a couple verses because last week I kept thinking, oh no, I'm going to go long, and I went long, so I eliminated a couple verses, and I have to talk about them today. And one of them is the results of dying with Christ. Back in verses 3 through 5, Paul has established the fact that believers participate with Jesus in His death and resurrection. We are there. We are part of that when we accept that into our lives. Now he's going to elaborate on each of those facts. He's going to talk about His death, and we're talking about those in verses 6 and 7. And then he talks about the life side of that in verses 8, 9, and 10. In verse 6, Paul begins this change by replacing the we that he had in the first verses with the words old self or old man that he has in these verses. And he replaces the words death with the word crucifixion as we identify with what Christ did in His death. The old man that Paul is talking about is likely our relationship to Adam. And we are connected to Adam's sin. We are connected to Adam's curse, going all the way back from you, all the way back through all your parents, all the way back to Adam. I don't know if that's as many generations as there should be. But we are connected to Adam. And I think he's talking about who we are in Adam. Paul is especially concerned that we understand what Christ did for us. He's not just this passive person. He is a super action figure who has come into our lives and has died for us. He has done this for us. And so we have to understand what follows from what Christ did. Paul talks about this body of sin that we have. And he says Christ, when He died, did away with that body of sin. He is not saying that your body is sinful. He is saying we do a lot of sinful things with it. He is saying that our bodies are dominated by sin. As he has said throughout the book of Romans, he said we are enslaved to sin. It's not just that we are sinners or that we sin. It's that we can't help it. We are dominated by sin. And Jesus, in his death, does away with that domination. He's saying our identification with Christ means that we're no longer dominated by sin. The purpose is so that we should no longer let sin reign in our bodies, so that sin would no longer enslave us. Sin is not what should characterize Christians. Christians should be characterized by love and all that Jesus Christ stands for. Verse 7 backs up what was going on in verse 6 by telling us that reminding his readers of this ancient proverb that said that death severs the hold of sin on a person. This was something that was going around in their world and that they believed, and Paul says this is true. Death severs sin's hold on us. And he's saying Christ's death, if we choose to accept it and allow it to work in our lives, separates sin's hold from us. The results of being raised with Christ are the next thing he's talking about. He's talked about his death, and now he talks about the resurrection and how that changes us. And he says that all the things that we do in life flow from this idea that we are resurrected in Christ. If we have died with Christ and are raised with Christ, then living for Christ automatically follows that. We enjoy, even now, the benefits of the resurrection. Now, there are a lot more benefits that we will never see in this life. But every day that you have a day of health, that is a benefit of the resurrection. Every time you have a job, that is a benefit of the resurrection. Every time you come to worship, that is a foretaste of the resurrection. It's not all of it yet, but even now we are experiencing that life in our life. In verse 9, Paul explains exactly what that resurrection means. He says that Jesus, how does it say that? Jesus now lives in a state in which death is no longer has power over him, or as death is no longer possible. Jesus is in that state now. And when we go to heaven, we will be in that state. But even before that, we experience some of the benefits. Jesus has conquered death, and if we belong to him, then we have the assurance of conquering death. I found this little picture of this nice little young lady putting a bullet into the back of Jesus' head, in the back of death's head. And I thought, wow, all right, I'll use that one. Because we put to death when we accept Jesus Christ's resurrection on our behalf. Paul returns to his main point in verse 10. This is kind of the bottom line for him. He says, when Christ himself died, then he died to sin. And in his having come to life, he now lives to God. And he says we do the same thing. When we die, when we believe in Jesus Christ, we identify with his death, and we have died to sin. And then when we identify with his resurrection, we now live for Christ. But why would Christ, the sinless one, have to die to sin? That's kind of a puzzling kind of statement. But really what he's trying to say is that his life and our life are linked together. Jesus was not held by sin's power in the way that would have turned him into a sinner. There was no way. Jesus was not a sinner. He committed no sin. But he was tempted like we are, and he has a real connection with us. And so Jesus can be said to be under the power of sin. He was subject to the power of sin. He was tempted as we are. And in this sense, he needed to die to sin's power. He was not a sinner, never sinned, so that he could die for us, but he was in the same place that we are. His life parallels our life. We can maintain this general parallelism between Christ's death and ours with him. I don't know if you've ever seen these before, but these are parallel lines here. But all these other lines make them look crazy. Our Christ's death and our identification with that death are parallel, even though they may look a little skewed. Paul does not imply that Christ ever lived without seeking God's glory and bringing him honor. Christ gave God glory all of his life. But he is saying that now he has new power, new authority, a new dispensation, as my dad would say, to carry out God's will and purposes. And then he moves on to talk about putting our new status into action. You know, he's just gotten this new inhaler. It's got life in it. It's got help him breathe. It's got the Spirit. And all he